Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for part two of our Change Management for Implementation webinar series, part of our greater AFBSS webinar series. And now, without further ado, I'd love to hand it over to our presenters, Suzanne Dobb and Nancy King.
I'm Nancy Camp, Managing Director for Care Delivery and Quality at Health Management Associates. I'm a nurse by background and training, and like Suzanne, love and embrace change management. I don't know how we can be in healthcare or how we can be consultants without loving change management. So hoping that as we move into today, Suzanne and I can share our expertise, our experiences, and some tools and tips for supporting all of the work that you all are embarking on, which is some big change. So let's look at the agenda for this morning and the objectives. So our agenda is going to be to go back over the change roadmap that we went over last week, but take it at a much deeper level and go step by step, do some interaction, some stepping back and thinking on how to apply some of these steps of the roadmap, and some tools to help support that. We also know that in change comes this thing called resistance, and resistance is innate in every change process. So we can't ignore it. We need to actually be able to identify it and take it head on and help to manage it and help to support those folks that are showing some resistance to some of the change patterns. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. The next slide then goes through our objectives for today, similar or connecting to our agenda. We hope that at the end of this session, you'll be able to describe the change roadmap and some of the tools needed on how to apply this through your change. That you will also be able to explain how managing resistance and gaining conviction and confidence can help to impact the change and successful personal change. As we've said, all change is personal. And also, hopefully, at the end of this session, you can describe how you would guide yourself and others from not just compliance, but to commitment. So making that full transition to the change and to adopting the new vision. All right, let's go then to the next slide and jump right in to our first area that we're going to spend a good chunk of time on today, which is delving again into that change roadmap in each step along the way. With our next slide, we want to actually just sort of put a pin in it and reinforce that you are the case today. We're not showing some hypotheticals or describing some other situations. We want you to be the case today. So as we're walking through these things, be thinking about your own situation, the changes you're embarking on, and how this can be applied. So our next slide actually just reiterates the visual of the change roadmap that we went through yesterday. So let's jump in. We're going to start with that first step in the roadmap again. What is the change? And do we have a shared goal or understanding? So when we think about this, again, what is the change? We want you, again, right now to step back and think about what is the change? What is granted, I realize there's probably multiple changes or different layers that's going to be happening, but what is currently the change you're undertaking? Can you define what the aim or the goal is of what you're changing? What the change is. Define your strategy. How are you going to get there? What's the mode or model that you're or approach you're using to get to that goal or aim? And how will you know when you've gotten there? That's again those measures. So these are the three things when you're thinking through a change. What's our goal or our aim we're going towards? Could be, a vision, but being very clear on a goal. How are you going to get there? What's the strategy or approach? And how will you know when you get there? What measures are going to tell you you're there? So let's take a couple minutes and jot down on paper, jot down what you think your goal or aim is for the change you're making. And I'm going to actually break this question up a little bit. First, I want you to just think about, in terms of the change you're currently undertaking, what is a goal or aim of what you're trying to accomplish? So think about for a minute, what are some of the measures of success for these aims?
My mind also went to how transferable these are to any project. So, I think it's great. But we're teaching a model, and that model is going to be applied here to AFBSS, but really could be the way you handle change in your organization.
Mhm. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few more seconds to think about what are some concrete measures of success, measures that will tell you you've accomplished this aim. Yeah. And I would say too, just a general advice and guidance on this, the more specific you can be on your aim and goal, the more specific your metric will become, and the more tied together those two things can be, like a direct cause effect and reinforcement of that with the measures. So, we want to try to not have aims of solve world hunger, right? Something that's more specific, more tangible. I love like 10% increase, love numerical goals because it makes it much easier for us to measure towards that. And it also inspires people. It motivates people to have numeric goals and then see measures that help show progress towards those goals. Okay. So the more we can get the specifics, the more we can share that with other people, we can then build that shared visioning that we talked about in the first meeting around this. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And I'm just testing out some of these like tools and things on you all, but you can then use these as change agents, as change leaders. You can use these in different settings that you're in with your team or in meetings or whatever. So this is just a very simple kind of check and balance. And we use this and we call it a confidence ruler. So using this confidence ruler, how important is that change to you on a scale of 1 to 5? And you see here 1, not important, which doesn't mean it's not important, you don't care, but maybe you don't really know anything about this. Maybe people on your team aren't as aware of what this really is, and they might rate this as a 1. Um, Somewhat important, you've heard about this, but you don't know how it's even going to involve you. 3, it's on my list of all the changes that need to get done, but it's maybe not, a top priority or personally, connecting with it. 4, it's important, changes on the strategic plan. There's resources to put into it and I'm committed. Very important. Leadership has put this to the top of the list. They're asking for routine progress updates. It's like on our mind every day. So, and I know, you all might sort of I might be preaching to the choir here on these because I think most of you are probably change leaders or change agents in this, but let's just for the sake of the exercise, kind of think this through. Where would you put yourself on the confidence ruler? And then this again is a simple tool you could be using with your teams and with others to kind of get a feel for where folks are at. And this also is going to be a way to be thinking through, resistance and helping with the change levers to help support this change. And again, this just kind of helps you quantify. In some ways, it's almost quantifying your readiness, emotional readiness, as well as technical readiness. So, and it doesn't mean that this won't change, right? This number can change over time as you progress, as the project work progresses, and so forth and so on. Okay, let's move on to the next slide then. And we're going to move into step two. Step two then is, okay, so step one, we've got the change, we know the aim, the goal, we've got some measures, we've talked with people about it, we hopefully have some shared visioning. Maybe we've done that confidence ruler, we know where people are at a little bit and what that'll drive our next steps of what all things we need to do. Step two is how do we manage and lead to support this change? And there were a couple key things in this step two from last week, if you remember. One is identifying key roles for this particular in this particular change, and number two was your organizational readiness. So looking at this first one of your key roles. Change leader, change agent, change subject. And the definitions here are, thinking through the change leader. This may be you, may not be you, that role has to promote the vision, dedicated to communication, and help to legitimize the change that's being implemented. Change agents are those folks that are really ensuring the change day to day is happening. They're the implementers, they're the doers, they're more the on the ground leaders, okay? And they also have to have belief in the vision or the aim of the work. And then you've got what we call change subjects, which are the people day to day that are going to be most impacted by that change. So thinking through those roles. So let's go to the next slide, and we think through how do we decide who is in these roles, and are they the right folks in the roles? And I mean, change subjects, we don't really get a choice to say, well, they're not the right people in the role, right? Like they're the day to day that are going to be impacted by the change. How do we help build their ability to do this? So when we think about the people and change or innovation, we need to build those change agents and those change subjects as well to feel more comfortable and confident with the change. With that, I just want to make a couple points here. Number one, people differ in reaction and receptivity to change. People can resist one change, but be very interested in another. So we don't want to, we don't want to put people in a bucket and say, oh, that person's a naysayer. They're not good with change. They may be wonderful with a change that means something to them, right? So there's going to be different levels and different reactions and different patterns of response. And this is really important as change leaders and change agents to understand. The next slide gets deeper into that as we show sort of this what's called a diffusion of innovation. I don't know if you've heard of this, maybe you've studied this in the past in school. It's actually quite like very old concept and theory that's been written about and is still true to this day. And when we look at what we call the diffusion of innovation, the adoption or curve of diffusion. So here in this bell-shaped curve, you see on the far left, the innovators, people who love change, all change, every change. They're just very excited about the change. Almost sometimes to the point where they're so over the top, you've got to rein them back in a little bit. Those are those innovators, and there's not very many of them. Then you have early adopters. You have the early majority and late majority up at the top, and the largest components of the bell-shaped curve. And then you have what many people don't like this term, but it is the term that's in the literature called laggards. Those that are more resistant, don't really want to do this change. Again, someone who is an innovator in one change could potentially actually be a laggard in another type of change. We can't lump people, we can't, judge them as this is their personality. It's not. It is dependent on how they're feeling with this particular change and transition. Do they agree with the vision? Do they have, as we talked about last time, do they have a dissatisfaction with the current process? Do they feel a need for the change? Those kinds of things is what's putting you in different areas on this diffusion scale. The reason I show you this is because you want to think about who the folks are on your team and where they sit on this diffusion curve, because it will help you understand who is going to be a really good change agent. Who could you partner with to help lead some of this change? And the ones you want to really pick are actually early adapters or early majority. Innovators are great to give you lots of innovative ideas. They're typically not good people to lead the overall change because they're so far off on the innovation that they can't really help those that are really needing some day-to-day support in the change. So early adopters, early majority are really the ones to focus on for change agents. It's also fabulous to partner early adopters with late majority because those late majority are sitting there not sure. And if you partner them up with an early adopter, that early adopter can help bring them over and bridge that gap and bring them over to that other side of early majority, early adopter. So I wanted to just share that with you. This is a nice little tool to use to really help identify where folks are at. And again, where you're at in one change project, you may not be at that same spot in another one, and it's just good for us to recognize that. So the next slide is a little bit deeper thinking about this step two. But this is what you would typically do is think through all your change leaders or maybe your team at this point and list who you think are really the leaders of the change. And it may be yourself as one of them, or maybe not. Maybe you see yourself as more a change participant or a change agent, but not necessarily a leader of the change. And then list your change agents in the organization, those you want on the team or you want to engage with others on the team. And so the steps here to really do is to think through these, make your lists, and then think through that diffusion of innovation curve and think, where do you think these folks are on that? And, you may have conversations with them and ask them. You may be talking with them about, the shared vision and the goal, and you may use the confidence ruler with them to see where people are at. That's going to help you understand where do we have some smooth sailing, where do we want to use some of our change agents more, and where do we have, some gaps that we want to be prepared for. That's the whole point of this change roadmap, is to be thinking about this change ahead of time and proactively and building more confidence, more conviction, more engagement from as many people as possible. The next slide then continues on a little bit of step two. I'll go through this one a little more quickly, but this is that readiness assessment of your organization. So the first part of step two is really the people, right? The people in the roles and understanding their level of confidence and commitment. But you also have to look at your organization's focus and how from an infrastructure and culture standpoint, how ready is your organization to take on this change? The next slide goes through that a little bit in terms of what is that organizational readiness checklist. We talked about this a little bit last week, but I'll just reiterate, 8 times 8 ways for people to learn. Is there a compelling purpose or vision? Is the whole of your organization, leadership bought into that purpose or vision? Does your organization have flexibility and responsive culture to change in the past? And if the answer is no, that doesn't mean this is going to be, a bust. It just means you've got more work to do to help bring the individuals along and help them in that diffusion of innovation here. And you need to use those change levers we're going to talk about, that communication, training, reinforcement. You're going to have to use those change levers even more. What's been the prior change experience? Again, if the change experience has not been flexible or quick to change, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way. It's good to just understand that and acknowledge that and talk about it, because that's the first way that you're going to start changing that experience and changing that culture. There needs to be some aligned incentives. That's something you all can be looking at when you think about your aims and goals. Are these incentives aligned across the organization towards this same vision? And what other big changes are going on? So this is capacity. This is change capacity. We know what burnout is all about in organizations, and organizations really do need to think, excuse me, about how much capacity for change they have at the moment. How many large, transformational changes are going on at the same time. So those are sort of your higher level organizational readiness checklist that is part of step 2 as well. All right, let's move on to the next slide, which is step 3. And step 3 was who and what will be affected by the change and to what degree, right? What is that impact? And we talked about this last time in terms of you're going to want to think through the impact of the changes on the actual work process, on the individual people, on the formal and informal organizational structures, and then what, who, and how much. So these things that are listed here, we actually put on a worksheet and list it out. And I mean, it might sound like, wow, this is a lot of, you're going to have a worksheet with all these things on it. Yes, because this is how you start to manage the change, is first identifying where those possible gaps and triggers for resistance, for change not sticking or being sustainable, where are those areas potential? Step 4, I'll spend some time on here, and then I'm going to wrap up my portion here. So step 4 is really these change levers. And I've listed it here. I'm going to go into it a little bit deeper, but you all have all these slides. But this is really the crux of then moving from here to there. We've done all this prep. We've got people identified, key roles. We've got our aims. We know what's going to be most impacted and what. How do we now help that? How do we help people through that? And that is using these change levers and repeating them over and over and over again. So if we let's go to the next slide, which actually shows sort of a repeat of this one in terms of the 4 change levers. And the key thing on this one is to remember all change is personal. Even when we're doing technical changes, there is a personal aspect of it, and we need to recognize that and manage towards that. The next slide really talks about that in terms of a WIFM. If any of you have heard of a WIFM is what's in it for me. And that is how we help people through some of this and get people on board, is understanding what is personal to them and what is in it for them to embrace this and move forward. And WIFMs are going to be very different from one person to another. But as change agents and leaders of change, it's important for you to understand what those WIFMs are. Sometimes there's a WIFM for a whole stakeholder versus an individual person. But remember, all change is personal. So let's go to the next slide and jump into each of these change levers a little bit more. The first one, communication. In some ways, I feel this is the most important, but they're all pretty darn important. The point here to make on communication is that you need to communicate multiple ways, multiple times, and not expect that we're communicating once in one way is going to get through to everyone. So as a sort of some high-level guidance, always be thinking about what's your communication for. Is it to share awareness? Is it to share knowledge? Is it to share action? Those are three different purposes, and it therefore drives the way and the type, the modalities of the communications you use. Is it simply an awareness saying, hey, Friday, this is going live? Is it knowledge saying, Friday, these five things are happening. These are the things you need to know, da 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 da. Or is it action saying, by Friday, we need you to read through this new policy and procedure and understand how to, come to work and do this work on Friday. Those are three different types of communications. And so thinking through that will really help you on that end game. What is the intent? That's really what I'm talking about. What's the intent of the communication? How are you messaging it? What kind of channel or modalities? And who is the audience? And did we get feedback from the audience that what we communicated was what we intended? Okay. So communication is key. Communicate all you can to all those who need to know. We don't want people making up what they don't know. The next change lever then on the next slide is training. This one goes really hand in hand with communication, right? Because it adds knowledge and confidence to people. Again, you guys know this, you're assessing where the need is for the training, you design the training, develop, you deliver, and always evaluate. That's the feedback loop on training is evaluating knowledge gain, competency, and satisfaction in it, satisfaction in the training. And then we want to continue to repeat trainings. Remember, training once does not make someone a competent expert. And that's really what we want to get to is competence and comfort. And comfort builds confidence. Okay. Next slide is the change lever of reinforcement. Reinforcement is really to help people do the right things easier. That could be technology supports, forcing functions, so you don't have to rely on human nature to think about something. Training and competency testing is a reinforcement, and regular monitoring and data feedback reinforces you're doing the right thing or reinforces we're not making progress here. We got to go back and hit, some past trainings and communications because we're not making progress. So that data feedback, as you're seeing a pattern here, is really important in the change levers. And then the fourth change lever is personal support. That's on the next slide. And this one, I don't have a lot of things to help you with because this is different for each person. There's no simple formula or support. You just need to talk with people, help manage the resistance, which Suzanne will talk about in a second. Last slide then on my part is step 5, which is basically aligning everything to sustain it. You're aligning the behaviors with the work. And really, step 5 is purely continuing to monitor and repeat the 4 change levers. And you want to keep asking that same question. Are we on course? If not, what do we need to do to get back? What are we learning from our experiences? That's a continuous quality improvement mindset that helps develop that culture for change management. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne to talk briefly about identifying and managing some resistance.
Sure, great. Thanks, Nancy. It's always a pleasure to learn from you. So, whenever we talk about change, we're going to be talking about resistance because resistance is inherent in every part of change. So let's look at the next slide. A lot of the material that we're going to show you probably feels pretty intuitive, and a lot of it might be, very deliberately and intentionally putting it into action. But we know that, again, resistance is a normal human response to change and to any disruption. It's kind of a protective stance, right? It says, if this is what makes me feel safe, This is what I'm familiar with. This is what's important to me. And um, and resistance is usually a change that people uh, care about the change, but they're not opposed to it. They're just concerned about it. So I think your best bet is to really think about resistance as information and think about it as feedback, not really as a barrier to care. And then, also how do we think about resistance? We really want to stay away from this idea that resistance is just a sign of disloyalty or poor performance or certainly a personal attack on you as a leader. And most importantly, it's not something to really fight or to overcome, and it's not any kind of evidence that the change process is failing. That's important to remember because it can feel tough when you're kind of up against a wall of upset. Let's look at the next slide. And you know, thinking about the most common errors that people make, my guess is that these make a lot of sense. You probably know, and maybe have done most of these. I certainly have. The key shift that you want to make in your mind is to really, embrace the resistance, right? Because it is telling you something. So, you want to get curious about the resistance. And, you instead of saying, how can I just eliminate this resistance? You want to be asking, what is this resistance trying to tell me? And how can I use that, again, information as feedback? And again, my guess is that you know this. It's very intuitive, and in the heat of things, it can be frustrating and difficult to deal with it. So let's look at the next slide, and again, look at probably your best bet, your most effective behaviors that you can show as a change leader in terms of managing the resistance. And I'm guessing again that most of you are familiar with these core tenets. Um, the main thrust of them being that relationships, trust, and rapport are always key, right? That is your social currency, right? Your social cred. That communicating, we hear it over and over from folks, communicating clears things up, offering things transparently and directly is really almost like I would say kind, right? That is the kindest thing that you can do as folks are very stressed out, is being the best communicator that you can be often. So not so much dumping a whole lot of information, but breaking it up, doing it often, and knowing the people on your team and how they want to be communicated with, how much time they need to kind of metabolize it. Um, so you want to use that, that sort of adage that we talk about of occupying 25% less airtime. You want to be able to ask questions, ask ideally open-ended questions, and then be quiet, right? And let that person talk. Be okay also if they need time to sit and think and to be quiet, really, giving them the space that they need to gather their thoughts. Um, for some people that might mean like, let me absorb this and I'll come back to you tomorrow. For some folks, they may be able to really think it through and kind of distill it quicker. And you can always say, and I'd like you to think about it and we'll talk about it some more. It doesn't always have to be a simple kind of one and done. So, as a change leader, your job is to be empathic, to be understanding about the resistance and not defensive and not trying to convince somebody or win them over. But it's to really be empathic, be understanding, and say, and nevertheless, this is happening. I had a supervisor once who would say, hold them in one hand and kind of push them with another, right? So it's not like you're just saying agreeing with everybody or just being kind. You're basically just, holding that person with empathy and also saying, and we need to change. So let's continue moving on. All right, so let's let me also say that at the end of this deck, we included several slides that expand on these ideas, provide more detail about being a change leader as well as managing resistance. And we really hope we didn't have time to cover them all today, but we really do encourage you to take a look at them because they might offer you some good and interesting ideas.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's webinar. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to us at info@afbsstraining.org. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.